Imagine having everything: power, wealth, status, a palace bigger than most hotels, and still feeling like a prisoner. That was Cornelia Vanderbilt. By the age of 25, she had it all. By her 30s, she wanted none of it. What happened inside those walls that made one of America's richest women walk away and never come back? She was born into a house so large, most people would get lost before they found the front door. On the 22nd of August 1900, Cornelia Vanderbilt entered the world not in a hospital, not in a modest family home, but inside Biltmore Estate, a place that looked less like a residence and more like a kingdom carved out of stone. By the time she took her first breath, her life had already been decided. Because Cornelia wasn't just a child, she was a Vanderbilt. And in America, at the turn of the 20th century, that name meant power, influence, and a level of wealth so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend. Her great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man they called the Commodore, had built one of the greatest fortunes in American history, first through steamships, dominating the waters along the East Coast, and then through railroads, controlling the veins of a rapidly expanding nation. By the time he died in 1877, his empire was worth more than most countries could dream of. That wealth didn't disappear, it multiplied. It spread across generations like a quiet, unstoppable force until it reached Cornelia. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, inherited a portion of that empire, not the largest share, but still enough to live a life beyond imagination. A man obsessed not with business, but with legacy. And so, before Cornelia was even born, he decided to build something that would outlast him, something no one could ignore. He chose the rolling hills of North Carolina, far from the noise of New York society, and purchased over 100,000 acres of land. Then, he hired the finest architect of his time. Thousands of workers labored for years, stone by stone, room by room, until finally, in 1895, Biltmore Estate stood complete. A 4-story mansion, a basement and sub-basement, over 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, dozens of bathrooms, a grand banquet hall towering like a cathedral, a library filled with tens of thousands of books, hidden corridors for staff, massive kitchens that never seemed to rest. There was even an indoor swimming pool, something almost unheard of at the time. But Biltmore wasn't just big, it was overwhelming. Inspired by the grand chateau of the French Renaissance, it was designed to impress, to dominate, to make anyone who stepped inside feel small. And for Cornelia Vanderbilt, it was the only world she knew. As an only child, she grew up surrounded by beauty, luxury, and silence. No siblings to argue with, no neighborhood children running through the halls, no ordinary chaos of a normal childhood. Instead, her days were filled with structured routines and quiet observation. Servants moved like shadows through the corridors. Tutors came and went. Guests arrived dressed in elegance, speaking in tones that carried both politeness and distance. Everything was perfect, too perfect, because in a house where everything is controlled, nothing is truly alive. Cornelia could walk for miles across the estate and never reach its edge. Forests, gardens, hidden paths. It was a world designed to feel infinite. But there's a strange truth about growing up in a place like that. When your world is too big, you can start to feel very small. There were no equals around her. Everyone she met either served her or expected something from her. Even as a child, she wasn't just Cornelia. She was the heir. Every glance, every lesson, every carefully planned day was shaping her into something predetermined, a future lady of the estate, a symbol of wealth and continuity. But no one ever asked a simple question: what if she didn't want that life? What if, beneath all the polished marble floors and golden chandeliers, there was a girl who felt trapped? Because while the world saw Biltmore as a dream, for Cornelia Vanderbilt, it was a beginning she would one day try to escape. And when that moment came, she wouldn't just leave the house. She would leave everything. As Cornelia grew older, the vast halls of Biltmore no longer felt magical. They felt repetitive, almost suffocating. Her early education took place inside the estate itself, guided by private tutors who followed strict schedules, shaping her into what society expected a Vanderbilt daughter to be: cultured, refined, and controlled. Every subject she learned, every book she read, carried an invisible purpose to prepare her for a life already decided. Yet even at a young age, there were subtle signs that Cornelia didn't quite fit into that mold. She asked questions that didn't have polite answers. She grew restless during routines that others considered privilege. And while adults around her admired her intelligence, they also quietly noted something else, something harder to define. She didn't seem content. Eventually, she was sent to the Madeira School in Virginia, one of the most elite boarding schools for girls at the time. It was supposed to complete her transformation into a proper young lady. For the first time, Cornelia was surrounded by girls her own age, girls who laughed freely, formed friendships, and lived lives far more ordinary than hers. But instead of finally fitting in, Cornelia stood out even more. She was different not just because of her wealth, but because of the invisible distance she carried inside. While others adapted, she observed. While others followed rules, she questioned them. And beneath that quiet observation, something continued to grow, a feeling that the life waiting for her was not one she had chosen. Then, in 1912, something happened that would later feel like a shadow following her entire life. Cornelia and her parents were in England, preparing to return to America. Their original plan was to sail aboard the Titanic, the most luxurious ship ever built, a floating symbol of human confidence and power. But at the last moment, her father changed the plan. They left a week earlier on a different ship. Days later, the Titanic sank into the Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 lives with it. Had they not changed their plans, Cornelia Vanderbilt, along with her parents, might have vanished into history right there. It was a narrow escape, too narrow. And though no one spoke of it often, it left behind an unspoken weight, as if fate had brushed past her and decided, for reasons unknown, to let her live. The older Cornelia became, the more Biltmore revealed its true nature, not as a paradise, but as a carefully constructed world with invisible walls. Every day followed a rhythm that never changed. Every corridor echoed with quiet order, and every interaction reminded her of who she was supposed to be. Guests arrived in elegant carriages, their conversations filled with politics, wealth, and expectations, and though Cornelia was present, she often felt like she was watching from a distance, as if her life was unfolding without her permission. The estate was alive with activity, yet emotionally distant. A place where warmth was replaced by formality and affection was often hidden behind etiquette. She learned how to host, how to speak, how to behave, but not how to belong. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, forests and gardens offering an illusion of freedom. Yet even there, boundaries existed, lines drawn not on maps but in expectations. She could walk for hours and still remain within the world her father had built, a world designed to protect, to impress, and to contain. And slowly, without anyone truly noticing, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was quieter than that. A question forming beneath the surface: was this life truly hers, or simply a role she had been placed into since birth? The servants still moved silently. The routines remained unchanged, and the grandeur of Biltmore continued to dazzle every visitor who stepped inside. But for Cornelia, the illusion had begun to crack, because when you grow up surrounded by everything, you begin to notice what's missing. And in her case, what was missing couldn't be bought, inherited, or built out of stone. It was something far more dangerous to a world like hers' choice. And though she didn't act on it yet, that realization marked the true beginning of her story. Because the girl who had everything was slowly becoming the woman who would one day walk away from it all. Leaving Biltmore for the first time did not feel like freedom. It felt like stepping into a world that moved too fast, spoke too openly, and expected her to be something she wasn't sure how to become. At the Madeira School, Cornelia was no longer surrounded by servants or watched over as a symbol of legacy. She was simply another student, expected to adapt, to socialize, to belong. But belonging did not come easily. The other girls formed friendships naturally, laughing in ways that felt unrestrained, sharing secrets, building connections that Cornelia observed but struggled to enter. Her wealth set her apart, but it wasn't just that it was the way she had been raised, the quiet distance that had shaped her since childhood. While others followed routines without question, Cornelia hesitated, analyzing, resisting in small, almost invisible ways. Teachers noticed her intelligence, her ability to grasp ideas quickly, yet they also sensed something else beneath the surface, a detachment, as if she were present physically but elsewhere in thought. She was learning, yes, but not just from books. She was studying people, behavior, the structure of a world that operated differently from the one she came from. And in doing so, she began to see something unsettling. Outside Biltmore, life was not predetermined. Choices existed. People changed direction, made mistakes, pursued passions without the weight of an inherited identity pressing down on them. It was a revelation, but also a source of quiet conflict, because the more she understood that freedom existed, the more she realized how little of it she actually had. She could follow the path laid out for her, step into the role of a Vanderbilt heiress, marry within her class, maintain the image expected of her, or she could question it all. At that stage, she did neither completely. Instead, she hovered in between, observing, absorbing, waiting, and though no one around her could fully see it, something had already begun to change. The world had opened just enough to show her that another life was possible, and once that idea takes root, it doesn't simply disappear. Even among privilege, Cornelia could not escape the quiet pressure of expectation that followed her everywhere, shaping not only how others saw her, but how she was meant to see herself. At Madeira, that pressure became more subtle but no less powerful. It was no longer enforced by servants or structured routines, but by social codes, whispered judgments, and the invisible hierarchy among girls who were all being prepared for the same future: to marry well, behave properly, and maintain the delicate image of refinement. Cornelia understood the rules quickly, but understanding them did not mean accepting them. She participated when necessary, attended lessons, joined conversations, and performed the role expected of her, yet there was always a distance, a hesitation that never fully disappeared. While others seemed to grow into their roles, Cornelia remained aware of the performance itself, as if she were playing a part in a story she hadn't agreed to. Small acts of quiet resistance began to appear. She questioned traditions that others followed without thought, showed little interest in the carefully curated path of becoming a society woman, and displayed an independence that was difficult to categorize at the time. It wasn't rebellion, in the obvious sense. There were no dramatic outbursts, no open defiance, but rather a steady refusal to fully surrender to expectations. Those around her began to describe her as different, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with concern. There was an unpredictability to her, a sense that she might not follow the script laid out for her life, and perhaps what unsettled people most was not what she did, but what she might do. Because in a world built on predictability and tradition, someone who questions the system even quietly becomes impossible to fully control. Cornelia was still young, still outwardly compliant, but the foundation beneath her identity was shifting. The life waiting for her: wealth, marriage, responsibility was no longer something she accepted without thought. It had become something she was beginning to examine, to measure, to doubt. And once doubt enters a life like hers, it changes everything, even if no one can see it yet. The closer Cornelia moved toward adulthood, the more the world around her seemed to tighten its grip, as if every step she took was being quietly guided toward a future already decided long before she could question it. By the time she left Madeira, there was an unspoken understanding of what came next: higher education, social refinement, and eventually, a marriage that would reinforce the standing of the Vanderbilt name. She briefly attended the University of North Carolina, an experience that should have marked a new level of independence, yet even there, the same invisible boundaries followed her. She was never just another student. She was always Cornelia Vanderbilt, the heiress, the symbol, the continuation of a legacy that stretched far beyond her own desires. The expectations did not need to be spoken aloud. They existed in every introduction, every glance, every assumption made about her future. And while others around her moved forward with certainty, Cornelia carried a growing sense of hesitation, as if she were standing at the edge of a path she was expected to walk, unsure whether she wanted to take the first step at all. It was during this period that the contrast between what she had and what she wanted became impossible to ignore. She had access to wealth, influence, and opportunity on a scale few could imagine, yet none of it answered the question that had been forming quietly inside her for years. Was this life truly hers, or was she simply continuing a story written by others? That question lingered, unresolved, shaping her thoughts in ways that were not yet visible from the outside. To everyone else, she was exactly what she was supposed to be, a young woman of status, moving steadily toward a predictable future. But beneath that surface, something far more significant was taking place. The doubt that had once been subtle was now becoming impossible to ignore, and with it came a quiet but powerful realization. If she continued down this path, she might never discover who she was beyond the name she carried. And for Cornelia Vanderbilt, that realization was not just unsettling, it was the beginning of a decision that would eventually change everything. In March of 1914, the world Cornelia had always known shifted in a way that no amount of wealth could prevent. Her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II, the man who had built Biltmore, who had shaped the world she grew up in, died suddenly at the age of 51. What began as a routine medical procedure to remove his appendix ended in complications, a blood clot in his lung, taking his life far too soon. For the first time, the towering stability of her world revealed its fragility. The man who had controlled everything, the estate, the structure, the future, was gone. And with his death came something far heavier than grief. It was responsibility. His estate, valued at around $50 million, was one of the largest private fortunes in America at the time. While much of it initially passed to her mother, Edith, there was never any doubt about where it would ultimately lead. Cornelia was the only child, the only heir. The future of Biltmore and a significant portion of the Vanderbilt legacy would one day rest entirely on her shoulders. At just 14 years old, she may not have fully understood the scale of what awaited her, but the shift was already happening. The way people spoke to her changed. The way they looked at her changed. She was no longer just the daughter of a powerful man. She was becoming the center of that power herself. And yet, in the quiet moments, away from formalities and expectations, there was something else she felt, something far more human. Loss, not of wealth, not of status, but of the one person who had unknowingly defined the boundaries of her world. Because despite everything, Biltmore had been her father's creation, his vision brought to life in stone and space. Without him, the estate remained, but its meaning began to shift. What was once a symbol of grandeur slowly became something else entirely, a place tied not just to legacy, but to absence. And in that absence, Cornelia stood at the beginning of a transition she could no longer avoid. Childhood was ending, and in its place, a future shaped by expectation, inheritance, and pressure was quietly closing in around her, whether she was ready for it or not. After her father's death, the structure of Cornelia's life did not collapse, it tightened. Her mother, Edith, assumed control of the estate and its immense responsibilities, ensuring that Biltmore continued to function with the same precision and dignity that George had maintained. On the surface, everything remained stable. The staff continued their duties, the estate remained immaculate, and the Vanderbilt name carried on without interruption. But beneath that surface, a subtle shift had taken place, one that centered entirely on Cornelia. She was no longer simply being raised, she was being prepared. Conversations around her began to carry a different tone, one that spoke not just of her present, but of her future role as the sole inheritor of a vast and influential legacy. Financial structures were arranged, trust funds carefully managed, and provisions put in place to ensure that when the time came, Cornelia would step seamlessly into her position. By the early 1920s, she was set to receive an allowance of $2 million a year, an amount so staggering that it placed her among the wealthiest individuals in the world before she had even fully entered adulthood. And yet, for all the planning and precision, something essential remained unaddressed. No one asked what she wanted. The assumption was simple. She would accept the life prepared for her. She would maintain Biltmore, uphold the Vanderbilt reputation, and continue the legacy without deviation. To most, it was an extraordinary privilege. To Cornelia, it was beginning to feel like something else entirely. A path that grew narrower, the closer she came to stepping onto it. She moved through her days as expected, learning, observing, fulfilling her role. But the quiet question that had followed her since childhood had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. Because now, the stakes were no longer abstract. The life ahead of her was real, defined, and approaching quickly. And once she stepped into it, there would be no easy way out. The world around her saw certainty, stability, and a future secured by wealth. But inside, Cornelia was beginning to understand something far more unsettling, that the life she was being prepared to inherit might not be one she could truly live. And that realization, though still unspoken, was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. As the years passed and Cornelia approached adulthood, the future that had once felt distant began to solidify into something unavoidable. By 1921, she reached the age where the financial structures arranged for her would fully activate, granting her access to an income of millions each year and placing Biltmore firmly within her reach. On paper, it was the ultimate position: wealth, property, influence, and security beyond imagination. Everything that defined success in her world was now hers. And yet, the closer she came to fully stepping into that role, the more the weight of it pressed against her. This was no longer preparation, it was reality. She was expected to become the Lady of Biltmore, to embody the Vanderbilt name, to host, to manage, to continue a legacy that had been built over generations. It was a role with no room for uncertainty, no allowance for deviation. From the outside, it appeared effortless. Cornelia moved through society as expected, attending events, maintaining appearances, fulfilling obligations with the quiet composure that had been instilled in her since childhood. But beneath that surface, something far more complex was unfolding. The question that had once been a distant thought had now become a quiet tension she carried with her daily. Was this truly her life, or simply the continuation of someone else's vision? Biltmore, once a place of awe and wonder, now stood as a symbol of that question. Its grand halls, its endless rooms, its carefully preserved perfection, they represented everything she was meant to protect, and everything she was not sure she wanted. There was no obvious conflict, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where she openly resisted. Instead, it was a slow, internal shift, almost invisible to those around her. She fulfilled her role, but she did not fully inhabit it. She moved forward, but without certainty. And in that quiet space between expectation and desire, a decision was beginning to form, not yet defined, not yet acted upon, but present. Because when a life is built for you, the most dangerous thing you can begin to ask is whether you have the right to choose differently. And for Cornelia Vanderbilt, that question was no longer theoretical, it was becoming personal. By the early 1920s, the path laid out for Cornelia was no longer something distant or negotiable, it was actively unfolding. Society had expectations, and now it was time for her to meet them. It was during this period that she met John Francis Amherst Cecil, a man who, in many ways, fit perfectly into the world she was expected to remain in. He was older, composed, and came from an established British aristocratic background, a connection that strengthened the social standing of both families. Their meeting was not dramatic, not driven by passion or unpredictability. It was structured, appropriate, and entirely in line with what was expected of someone in her position. And so, in April 1924, Cornelia Vanderbilt was married at Biltmore Estate in a ceremony that reflected everything her life had been built around. The estate transformed into a stage of grandeur, filled with thousands of guests, elaborate arrangements, and a level of luxury that reinforced the image of the Vanderbilt name. From the outside, it was flawless, a union of wealth, status, and tradition. Cornelia, at 23, stood at the center of it all, stepping fully into the role that had been prepared for her since birth. The wedding was not just a personal milestone, it was a confirmation that the system had worked exactly as intended. She had followed the path. She had become what she was meant to be. And for a time, it seemed as though everything was aligning perfectly. The transition into married life came with a new identity, one that positioned her as the Lady of Biltmore, a figure of elegance and responsibility. The expectations shifted slightly, but they did not disappear, they simply evolved. She was now not only a Vanderbilt heiress, but also a wife, a partner in maintaining the estate, and a visible figure within high society. To those watching from the outside, it was the ideal life, the natural progression of privilege and legacy. But beneath that polished surface, something remained unresolved. The same quiet distance, the same internal hesitation that had followed her since childhood, did not vanish with marriage. If anything, it adapted, settling into her new life in ways that were difficult to detect, but impossible to fully suppress. Because while the world saw a perfect union, Cornelia was still carrying the same unspoken question, and now it was following her into a life that was becoming increasingly difficult to step away from. Marriage did not disrupt the rhythm of Cornelia's life, it refined it, reshaping her role without ever truly changing its direction. As the wife of John Francis Amherst Cecil, she stepped more visibly into the position she had long been prepared for, now not just as an heiress, but as the Lady of Biltmore itself. The estate, once her childhood world, became her responsibility, her stage, and her identity. Together, she and John maintained its operations, oversaw staff, hosted guests, and upheld the image expected of a Vanderbilt household. From the outside, everything appeared stable, even enviable. Their life was structured, secure, and surrounded by wealth that insulated them from the uncertainties faced by most of the world. In 1925, Cornelia gave birth to their first son, George, followed by William in 1928. With the arrival of children, her role deepened further now, not only a wife and heiress, but a mother, responsible for continuing the legacy into another generation. And for a time, this seemed to anchor her. The presence of her sons brought moments of warmth, a sense of purpose that felt more personal than anything she had experienced before. The estate was no longer just a symbol, it was now the place where her own family was growing. Yet even within this expanded life, the same quiet tension remained. Her days were full, her responsibilities clear, her position secure, but fulfillment did not come as naturally as it appeared it should. John gradually took on more control over the management of Biltmore, stepping into the role of decision-maker, while Cornelia's involvement became less defined. She was present, but no longer central, active, but not essential. And in that subtle shift, something began to erode. The structure of her life remained intact, but her sense of purpose within it grew uncertain once again. The expectations had been met. She had married, had children, had taken her place within the system. But the feeling that had followed her since childhood had not disappeared. It had simply adapted, becoming quieter, more complex, and harder to ignore. Because now, there was more at stake. Walking away would no longer mean leaving a role. It would mean leaving a life that included not only wealth and legacy, but family. And yet, even with all of that, the question remained, persistent and unresolved. Was this truly enough for her to stay? From the outside, Cornelia Vanderbilt's life had reached its ideal form: a powerful name, a respected husband, 2 sons, and control over one of the most extraordinary estates in America. It was the kind of life people admired without question, the kind that defined success in her world. But inside that perfection, something subtle began to fracture. The routines of Biltmore, once structured and predictable, now felt repetitive, almost mechanical. Days blended into one another, filled with responsibilities that were important, yet strangely hollow. Hosting guests, overseeing staff, maintaining appearances. These were tasks she performed well, but they did not fulfill her. And perhaps more unsettling was the growing realization that her presence, once central, was becoming less essential. As John took on greater control of the estate's management, decisions increasingly moved through him. Biltmore continued to function seamlessly, but Cornelia found herself drifting toward the edges of a life she was supposed to lead. There was no confrontation, no dramatic shift, just a gradual sense of displacement that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Even motherhood, which brought moments of genuine connection, could not fully silence the quiet unrest building within her. She cared for her sons, watched them grow, fulfilled her role as expected, but the deeper question remained untouched. It lingered beneath every routine, every obligation, every carefully maintained appearance. Because while everything around her suggested stability, her internal world was beginning to move in a different direction. The life she had built, or rather, the life that had been built for her, was no longer enough to contain what she was becoming. And that realization did not arrive suddenly. It developed slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading through something that once seemed unbreakable. There were no immediate consequences, no visible signs that anything was wrong. To everyone else, Cornelia Vanderbilt was exactly where she was meant to be. But within her, a shift had already begun, one that would not remain hidden forever. Because when a person begins to feel out of place in a life that appears perfect, the outcome is rarely stability. It is change. And for Cornelia, that change was already on its way. By 1930, the illusion of permanence surrounding Biltmore began to crack, not from within, but from the outside world. The Great Depression swept across America, dismantling fortunes, collapsing industries, and forcing even the wealthiest families to confront a new reality. For the Vanderbilts, the impact was not immediate ruin, but it was undeniable. Maintaining an estate as vast and complex as Biltmore required enormous resources, and for the first time, the idea that such a place might not sustain itself indefinitely became a serious concern. Faced with this pressure, a decision was made that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Parts of Biltmore would be open to the public. What had once been a private symbol of wealth and exclusivity would now become, in part, a destination for visitors willing to pay for a glimpse inside. It was a practical solution, one that would ultimately secure the future of the estate, but it also marked a significant shift in what Biltmore represented. The walls that once separated the Vanderbilt world from the rest of society were no longer absolute. Strangers would walk the same halls, observe the same rooms, and witness the life that had once been hidden behind layers of privilege. For many, it was a bold and innovative move. For Cornelia, it was something more complicated. The estate she had grown up in, the place that had shaped her identity, was changing in a way that reflected a deeper truth. Nothing, not even wealth on that scale, was immune to change. And as visitors began to fill the halls, bringing with them curiosity and admiration, Cornelia's relationship with Biltmore shifted once again. It was no longer just a home, or even a responsibility. It was becoming something else entirely, a space that existed both as a personal past and a public spectacle. And in that transformation, the distance she felt from it grew stronger. Because while others came to admire what Biltmore was, Cornelia could only see what it represented, a life she had never fully chosen, now slowly opening itself to the world, even as she began to feel increasingly separate from it. As Biltmore opened its doors to the public, the estate took on a new kind of life, one driven not just by legacy, but by necessity. Visitors arrived with fascination, walking through grand halls that had once been reserved for a select few, marveling at the scale, the detail, the sheer excess of it all. For them, it was an experience, a glimpse into a world far removed from their own struggles during the Depression. But for Cornelia, it was something far more personal. Each room they admired, each corridor they explored, was part of her history now turned into a spectacle. The distance she had been feeling for years began to deepen. She moved through the same spaces, but they no longer felt like hers. The estate continued to function, The guests continued to arrive, and John remained firmly in control of its operations, handling the practical realities with efficiency and purpose. In contrast, Cornelia's role became increasingly undefined. She was present, visible when necessary, but no longer essential to the daily rhythm of Biltmore. And in that quiet shift, something inside her began to harden into clarity. The life she was living, structured, predictable, and admired, was not fulfilling her in the way it was supposed to. The routines that once felt imposed now felt suffocating. The expectations that once guided her now confined her. Even the presence of her children, which brought moments of genuine connection, could not fully anchor her to a life that no longer felt like her own. There was no single moment of realization, no dramatic turning point, just a gradual accumulation of dissatisfaction that could no longer be ignored. The contrast between what she had and what she felt became impossible to reconcile, because while the world saw privilege, Cornelia increasingly felt limitation, and once that perception takes hold, it changes everything. The idea of leaving once unthinkable began to take shape, not as an impulsive escape, but as a possibility, a way to step outside the structure that had defined her entire existence. She had the means, the independence, and now the growing desire. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was whether she was willing to act on it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she was moving closer to an answer. By the early 1930s, the quiet tension that had followed Cornelia for years had reached a point where it could no longer remain internal. The life she was living, once defined by expectation, stability, and outward perfection, now felt increasingly disconnected from who she was becoming. There was no single crisis, no scandal, no dramatic collapse. From the outside, everything still appeared intact. But internally, the distance between her role and her identity had grown too wide to ignore. The routines of Biltmore, the responsibilities, the social obligations, all of it continued unchanged, yet her relationship to it had shifted completely. What once felt inevitable now felt optional. What once felt permanent now felt temporary. And in that shift, a realization took hold. She was not as trapped as she had always believed. Unlike most people, Cornelia had something that made a different kind of life possible: complete financial independence. She did not need Biltmore to survive. She did not need to remain within the structure that had defined her since birth. For the first time, the idea of leaving was not just emotional, it was practical. And that made it dangerous, because once a possibility becomes real, it demands a decision. She could stay, continue the life expected of her, fulfill every role perfectly, and maintain the image that had been built around her. Or she could walk away, step outside everything she had known, everything that defined her name, and attempt to build something entirely her own. It was not a simple choice. Leaving would mean more than abandoning a place. It would mean stepping away from her position, her responsibilities, and potentially even her family. It would mean facing uncertainty without the structure that had always guided her. But staying carried its own cost, a life lived within boundaries she no longer believed in. The balance between those two realities began to shift, slowly but decisively, and while no one around her could yet see it, the decision was already beginning to form. Because when a person reaches the point where staying feels more unbearable than leaving, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. And for Cornelia Vanderbilt, that moment was no longer far away. In 1932, Cornelia Vanderbilt did something that no one in her world expected and few could understand. Without warning, without a public explanation, she left Biltmore. There was no dramatic farewell, no confrontation, no visible collapse of her life. She simply walked away from it. From the estate, from the role she had spent her entire life preparing for, and from the structure that had defined her identity since birth. To those around her, it was sudden. But in reality, it had been building for years. Every doubt, every quiet moment of dissatisfaction, every question she had never voiced, had led to this decision. She went to New York, a city that stood in stark contrast to everything Biltmore represented. Fast, unpredictable, filled with people who lived lives not dictated by inheritance but by choice. There, she enrolled in art school. For the first time, Cornelia stepped into a world where her name mattered less than her actions, where she was not automatically defined by wealth or expectation. It was a radical shift, not just geographically, but psychologically. She was no longer the lady of Biltmore. She was simply a woman trying to explore something of her own. To many in high society, her decision was shocking. A Vanderbilt heiress leaving her estate to study art? It didn't fit the narrative. It disrupted the order people relied on. But for Cornelia, it was not rebellion for the sake of defiance. It was an attempt to find something that had always been missing: control, identity, meaning beyond the role she had inherited. And yet, even New York was not enough. The change, though significant, did not fully resolve the tension within her, because what she was searching for was not just a different environment, it was a different life entirely. And as she began to realize that, the distance between her past and her future grew even wider. Leaving Biltmore had been the first step, but it was not the final one, not even close. New York was supposed to be an escape, a place where Cornelia could redefine herself away from the weight of Biltmore and the Vanderbilt name. And for a brief moment, it worked. The city offered something she had never truly experienced before: anonymity. Among artists, students, and strangers moving through crowded streets, she was no longer immediately recognized as an heiress. She attended classes, explored creative expression, and stepped into conversations that were driven by ideas rather than status. It was unfamiliar, unpredictable, and in many ways liberating. But that sense of freedom came with a realization she hadn't fully anticipated. Even outside of Biltmore, she could not completely escape who she had been. Her past followed her, not just in how others occasionally recognized her name, but in how deeply it had shaped her way of thinking. The structure, the expectations, the identity, it had all been internalized over years, and breaking away from it was not as simple as changing location. New York showed her what a different life could look like, but it also made something else clear. If she truly wanted to escape the life she had left behind, she would have to go further. The city still felt connected to the world she came from, still too close to the expectations she was trying to leave behind. The distance she needed was not just emotional, it had to be physical, cultural, complete. And so, after only a few months, she made another decision, one that was even more definitive than the first. She left the United States entirely. Crossing the Atlantic, she settled in Paris, a city known for its art, its freedom, and its rejection of rigid social structures. This was not just a move, it was a separation, a deliberate step away from everything that had defined her life up to that point. And unlike her departure from Biltmore, this time there was no intention of returning. Cornelia Vanderbilt was not just leaving a place anymore, she was leaving an identity. Paris was not just a new city, it was a complete break from everything Cornelia Vanderbilt had once been. Here, the rules that governed her life in America no longer applied. Society was looser, identities were fluid, and reinvention was not only accepted but expected. And for the first time, Cornelia didn't just step outside her old life, she began to dismantle it entirely. In 1934, she finalized her divorce from John Francis Amherst Cecil, formally ending the marriage that had once symbolized her place within high society. Yet even that decision carried an unusual twist. While she severed her connection to him personally, John remained at Biltmore, continuing to manage the estate as if the structure of her former life could persist without her. But Cornelia was already moving far beyond that world. In Paris, she began to reshape herself in ways that shocked those who still followed her story from afar. She changed her name to Nilkar, a move that signaled more than just personal preference. It was a rejection of the Vanderbilt identity altogether. The name that had once defined her was no longer something she wished to carry. Along with this, her appearance transformed. She dyed her hair pink, later blue, choosing colors that reflected her growing interest in mysticism, numerology, and the concept of personal auras. Her clothing followed the same logic, shifting with her beliefs, her moods, and the seasons, creating an image that stood in stark contrast to the restrained elegance she had once embodied. To many, It appeared eccentric, even irrational. But to Cornelia, it was something else entirely, a form of control she had never truly possessed before. Every change she made was a decision, a step further away from the life she had not chosen. And yet, even as she constructed this new identity, traces of her past remained. Her children, George and William, were now being educated in Britain and Switzerland, living lives that bridged two worlds, the structured legacy of Biltmore and the unpredictable path their mother had taken. Cornelia saw them, but not in the way a traditional life would have allowed. Her choices had consequences, ones that extended beyond herself. Still, she did not turn back, because by this point, returning was no longer an option. She had crossed a line not just geographically, but psychologically. The woman who had once been Cornelia Vanderbilt was fading, replaced by someone entirely different. And whatever came next, it would not be a continuation of her past. It would be something entirely her own. As Cornelia now Nilchor settled deeper into her life in Europe, the transformation she had begun was no longer just external. It became the core of who she was. Paris gave her the freedom to experiment, to exist without the rigid expectations of American high society, and she embraced it fully. She moved through artistic circles, surrounded by painters, thinkers, and individuals who valued expression over reputation. In this environment, her eccentricities were not judged, they were accepted, even admired. But beneath the surface of this newfound freedom, her life was far from stable. Her identity, once clearly defined, was now constantly shifting, shaped by her beliefs, her relationships, and her desire to remain separate from her past. It was during this time that she became involved with a Swiss artist, a relationship that reflected her attraction to creativity and independence rather than status or tradition. This was a stark contrast to her first marriage, which had been rooted in expectation and structure. Here, there were no predefined roles, no obligations tied to legacy, only the present moment. Yet even in this freedom, there was a sense of unpredictability, a life without the stability she had once taken for granted. And then, as Europe moved toward chaos, everything around her began to change once again. The rise of conflict across the continent, the growing tensions that would soon lead to the Second World War, forced another shift in her life. Paris, once a symbol of artistic freedom, was no longer safe. And so, Cornelia made another move, this time to Britain. Once again, she adapted, shifting environments as circumstances demanded, continuing to build a life that existed outside the structures she had left behind. But unlike before, this was not just about personal transformation. The world itself was changing, and she could no longer remain untouched by it. The distance she had created between herself and her past remained, but now, external forces were beginning to shape her future in ways she could not control. And for the first time since she had left Biltmore, her life was no longer defined solely by her own choices. It was being pulled into something much larger. As war spread across Europe, the distance Cornelia had created between herself and her past was tested in ways she could never have anticipated. The world she had chosen, fluid, artistic, unstructured, was now colliding with a reality defined by conflict, uncertainty, and survival. In Britain, where she had relocated, life was no longer about reinvention or expression. It was about endurance. Air raid sirens replaced the quiet hum of Parisian streets, and the sense of freedom she had once embraced was overshadowed by the constant awareness of danger. Yet even in the midst of war, the consequences of her earlier choices continued to unfold. Her two sons, George and William, had grown up largely in Europe, educated in Britain and Switzerland, shaped by a life that moved between continents. And when the war came, they did not stand apart from it, they became part of it. Both joined the British Royal Navy, committing themselves to a conflict that would define their generation. For Cornelia, this was a different kind of reality, one she could not distance herself from through movement or reinvention. The war brought her family back into focus, but not in a way that restored what had been lost. Instead, it introduced a new kind of tension, the possibility of losing them entirely. In 1943, that possibility came dangerously close to becoming real. George and William were traveling from neutral Switzerland, passing through Vichy, France, and Spain on their way to Portugal. From there, they were meant to fly to England to reunite with their mother. But at the last moment, they were removed from their scheduled flight. Their seats were taken by others, including a well-known actor. The plane departed without them and was later shot down by German forces over the Bay of Biscay. Everyone on board was killed. Once again, in a way that echoed the near miss of the Titanic decades earlier, catastrophe passed within reach of Cornelia's family and moved on. Her sons survived, arriving safely in England on a different flight. It was another narrow escape, another moment where fate seemed to shift at the last possible second. But this time, the impact was different. The war had made everything more immediate, more fragile. The idea that life could change or end without warning was no longer abstract. And for Cornelia, who had spent years reshaping her identity and distancing herself from her past, this moment brought a stark clarity. No matter how far she had gone, how much she had changed, the connections she carried, especially to her children, remained. And in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed, those connections became impossible to ignore. The war did not just reshape the world around Cornelia, it reshaped her in ways that were quieter, but far more lasting. The constant uncertainty, the nearness of loss, and the fragile line between survival and tragedy began to strip away some of the layers she had built around herself over the years. The identity she had created in Paris, the colors, the mysticism, the reinvention remained, but it no longer carried the same intensity. War has a way of simplifying things, reducing life to its most essential elements. And for Cornelia, those elements were no longer about rejecting her past, but understanding what still mattered within it. Her sons, now fully grown and shaped by their own experiences in the war, became a central part of that realization. They were no longer children moving between continents. They were men facing real danger, making their own choices, living lives that extended beyond her influence. The distance that had once existed between them did not disappear, but it shifted into something more complex. There was a quiet acknowledgement, on both sides, of everything that had changed, of the unconventional path Cornelia had taken, and of the lives her sons had built within a world she had stepped away from. And yet, despite all the movement, all the reinvention, and all the distance, there was a sense that something in Cornelia's life was beginning to settle. Not return, she would never go back to being who she once was, but stabilize in a different way. The chaos of constant change, of redefining herself again and again, began to give way to something quieter, a life not driven by escape, but by continuity. The war would eventually end, but its impact would remain, marking a clear boundary between the person she had been before and the person she had become after. And as that chapter closed, Cornelia stood at another transition point, not one defined by rebellion or departure, but by the possibility of something she had rarely experienced before. Stability on her own terms, not inherited, not imposed, but chosen. And for the first time in her life, that possibility did not feel like a question. It felt like a direction. After the war, the world began to rebuild, and so did Cornelia, though in a far quieter, more grounded way than before. The restless movement that had defined her earlier years slowed, replaced by a life that, while still unconventional, carried a sense of continuity she had never truly allowed herself before. Britain became her home, not as a temporary escape, but as a place she chose to remain. The chaos of war had stripped away the illusion that life could be endlessly reshaped without consequence, and in its place came a more deliberate approach to how she lived. In 1949, Cornelia married again, this time to Captain Vivian Francis Bulkley Johnson, a decorated veteran of the First World War who had gone on to build a successful career in banking. Unlike her first marriage, which had been shaped by expectation and social alignment, this union was quieter, almost understated. There was no grand ceremony at Biltmore, no spectacle of wealth or status. Instead, they were married in a simple registry office in Kensington, London. Even her name reflected this shift. She chose to go by Mary during this period, a decision that seemed less about reinvention and more about privacy, about stepping further away from the identity that had once defined her so publicly. Their life together was stable, measured, and, by all accounts, far more peaceful than anything she had experienced before. They divided their time between a residence in London and a countryside estate in Oxfordshire known as the Mount. It was a life that still carried traces of her wealth, large homes, collections, vingac. Here, she was no longer trying to escape something, nor was she trying to prove anything. She was simply living, and in that simplicity, there was a kind of resolution that had been absent from her earlier years. The woman who had once left everything behind in search of identity had now reached a point where she no longer needed to constantly redefine herself. She had moved through wealth, expectation, rebellion, and war, and what remained was something quieter, but perhaps more real. A life chosen not in opposition to her past, but in quiet separation from it. Life at the Mount unfolded with a rhythm that was entirely different from anything Cornelia had known before, yet it still carried traces of her unique character. Surrounded by the quiet countryside of Oxfordshire, she and Vivian created a space that reflected both stability and individuality. The estate itself became a canvas for her evolving interests, particularly her fascination with art and collecting. Over time, their home filled with objects that spoke not of status, but of personal taste, most notably an extensive collection of historic Chinese vases, each piece carefully chosen, each carrying its own story. It was a subtle but meaningful shift from the grandeur of Biltmore. There, everything had been designed to impress. Here, things were chosen to reflect who she had become. Her life no longer revolved around maintaining an image or fulfilling expectations. Instead, it moved at a slower pace, defined by personal interests, quiet routines, and a partnership that appeared to offer the balance she had long been searching for. There was still an element of eccentricity in her choices, but it was no longer driven by the need to separate herself from her past. It existed naturally, as part of her identity, rather than as a statement against something else. At the same time, she became increasingly interested in emerging ideas around creativity and healing, particularly the concept of art therapy. It was a field that aligned with her lifelong connection to artistic expression, but also suggested a deeper layer, an understanding that art was not just about creation, but about processing experience, about giving form to emotions that could not easily be spoken. Through this, she formed connections with individuals who were exploring these ideas, including figures who would later become influential in the field. These relationships added another dimension to her life, one that was not rooted in wealth or legacy, but in shared curiosity and thought. And yet, even in this period of relative calm, time continued to move forward. The past, though distant, was never entirely gone. Biltmore still existed, her sons were still connected to it, and the Vanderbilt name continued without her. But for Cornelia, that connection no longer defined her place in the world. She had built something separate, something quieter, something that did not require constant reinvention or escape. For perhaps the first time, her life was not about leaving or becoming, it was about being. And in that stillness, there was a sense that she had finally reached a version of herself that no longer needed to be questioned. The years passed quietly, and for a time, it seemed as though Cornelia had finally reached a lasting equilibrium. Her life with Vivian continued in a steady, almost understated way, far removed from the intensity and unpredictability of her earlier decades. But in 1968, that stability was disrupted once again. Vivian Frances Bulkley Johnson died, bringing an end to the longest and most consistent chapter of her life. His absence did not trigger the kind of dramatic upheaval that had marked earlier turning points, but it did introduce a familiar sense of transition. Cornelia was once again alone, and with that came the question of what remained. By this point, she was no longer the restless woman searching for identity, nor the figure defined by rebellion against her past. She was older, more settled, but still fundamentally independent. And rather than retreat into isolation, she continued to engage with the world in her own way. Her interest in art therapy deepened, leading her into new social circles that were far removed from the aristocratic environments she had once inhabited. It was through this interest that she met Edward Adamson, a key figure in the development of art therapy in Britain. Their connection reflected something that had always been present in Cornelia's life, a draw toward creativity not as performance, but as understanding. And it was during one of these interactions, in a setting far removed from the grandeur of her past, that she encountered someone unexpected. William Goodsir, a waiter at the dinner where she and Adamson were present, was 26 years younger than her. The difference in age, background, and life experience could not have been more pronounced. And yet, in a way that mirrored many of the unconventional choices she had made throughout her life, Cornelia formed a connection with him. In 1972, at the age of 72, she married him. To many, it seemed surprising, even improbable, but for Cornelia, it was entirely consistent with the life she had chosen, a life not governed by expectation, but by personal decision, no matter how unconventional it appeared. They settled together at the Mount, continuing the quiet existence she had built, now shared with someone from a completely different world than the one she had been born into. It was, in many ways, a final affirmation of the path she had taken. From Vanderbilt heiress to independent, unconventional woman, she had never fully returned to the structures she left behind. And even in the later stages of her life, she continued to define herself on her own terms. By the early 1970s, Cornelia Vanderbilt, now far removed from the name that once defined her, was living a life that few could have imagined when she was born into Biltmore. At 72, newly married to William Goodsir, she had entered a stage of life that was neither a return to the past nor an attempt to reinvent herself again. It was something quieter, more final. The intensity that had once driven her decisions had softened, but the independence remained. At the Mount, her days unfolded with a steady rhythm. There were no grand social obligations, no expectations tied to legacy, no need to perform a role for anyone. The estate, though still reflective of her wealth, functioned more as a personal retreat than a symbol of status. She lived among the objects she had collected over the years, surrounded by the physical traces of a life that had moved across continents and identities. Her relationship with William, unconventional as it was, seemed to exist outside the judgments that might have defined it in earlier stages of her life. The difference in age, background, and experience did not follow the usual patterns of society, but Cornelia had long since stepped outside those patterns. What mattered was not how the relationship appeared, but how it functioned within the life she had chosen. And in that sense, it fit. There was a simplicity to this period that contrasted sharply with the complexity of everything that had come before. No dramatic changes, no sudden departures, no reinventions, just continuity. And yet, even within that calm, the past was never entirely absent. Biltmore still existed, still operated, still carried the Vanderbilt name forward through her sons and their descendants. It had become something else over the years, a historic site, a place open to the public, sustained not just by wealth, but by preservation. Cornelia's absence from it had not diminished its significance. If anything, it had allowed it to evolve independently of her, and perhaps that was fitting. The estate that had once defined her no longer required her presence to continue. It existed as part of history, while she lived her life apart from it. The separation was complete, not in conflict, but in quiet acceptance. Cornelia Vanderbilt had not returned, had not reclaimed her place, had not attempted to reconnect with the identity she had left behind. Instead, she had allowed that chapter to close fully. And in doing so, she had created a life that stood entirely on its own, separate from the legacy that had once seemed impossible to escape. As Cornelia moved deeper into the final years of her life, what stood out was not the wealth she had inherited, but the distance she had created from it. Decades had passed since she left Biltmore, and in all that time, she never truly returned, not for events, not for obligation, not even for moments that might have drawn most people back. The separation she had chosen was complete. Her life in England, particularly at the Mount, remained steady and largely private, far removed from the public image that once surrounded her name. She was no longer a figure of curiosity or controversy in the same way she had been during her earlier transformation. Instead, she existed quietly, almost outside the narrative that had once defined her. Meanwhile, the world she had left behind continued to evolve without her. Her sons, George and William, had taken on the responsibility of Biltmore, transforming it into a functioning enterprise that balanced preservation with practicality. What had once been a private residence became a historic attraction, visited by thousands, later millions, each year. The estate adapted, survived, and even thrived, but it did so independently of Cornelia. The legacy continued, just not through her presence, and perhaps that was the most defining aspect of her story. She had not destroyed her connection to the Vanderbilt name. She had simply stepped outside of it, allowing it to continue on its own path while she followed a different one entirely. There was no reconciliation, no dramatic return, no final moment where she re-entered the world she had left. Instead, there was distance. A consistent, deliberate distance that remained unchanged until the end. And within that distance, there was a kind of clarity. Cornelia had not been forced out of her life, she had chosen to leave it. Every step, every transformation, every decision had been her own, and by the time she reached the later years of her life, there was no indication that she regretted that choice. If anything, the consistency of her separation suggested the opposite. She had found a way to live outside the structure she was born into, and she had remained there, not temporarily, but permanently. It was not the path anyone expected of a Vanderbilt heir, but it was the one she chose, and she never turned back. In the quiet rhythm of her later years, there was no dramatic climax, no final transformation, only the steady continuation of a life she had deliberately shaped away from expectation. Cornelia no longer needed to prove anything, not to society, not to her family, and not even to herself. The questions that had once driven her about identity, purpose, and freedom had long since settled into something less urgent, but more certain. She had answered them not with words, but with the way she chose to live. At the Mount, her world remained small, controlled, and personal. The collections she had built over time, the spaces she inhabited, the routines she followed, they were all reflections of a life no longer influenced by outside pressure. Even her relationship with William Goodsir, unconventional as it was, existed without the need for validation. It simply was, and perhaps that was the most significant change of all. For someone who had spent so much of her early life being defined by others, by wealth, by name, by expectation, Cornelia had reached a point where definition no longer mattered. She existed without needing to fit into any framework. Meanwhile, the Vanderbilt name continued to carry weight in America, and Biltmore remained a symbol of that legacy, growing into one of the most recognized historic estates in the country. Visitors walked its halls, admired its architecture, and learned about the family that built it. But Cornelia's presence within that story became increasingly distant, almost like a fragment that did not fully align with the narrative. She was part of its history, but not its continuation, and that separation, once seen as unusual or even controversial, had by now become simply a fact. Time had normalized it. What once seemed like a break from tradition had become her identity. She was the Vanderbilt who left and stayed gone. And as her life moved quietly toward its final chapter, there was no sense of unfinished business, no indication that something had been left unresolved. Instead, there was a rare kind of completeness, not because everything had been perfect, but because everything had been chosen, and in that, Cornelia Vanderbilt's story reached a place that few lives ever do not defined by what was expected, but by what was decided. On the 7th of February 1976, Cornelia Vanderbilt's life came to an end in England, far from the place where it had begun. She was 75 years old. There was no return to America, no final journey back to Biltmore, no closing of the circle that had started in that vast estate decades earlier. Instead, her story ended exactly where she had chosen to live, away from the Vanderbilt name, away from the expectations that once defined her, and away from the legacy she had deliberately stepped out of. Even in death, she remained consistent with the life she had built. While many members of the Vanderbilt family were buried together in elaborate family plots in the United States, Cornelia chose a different path. She was cremated, and her ashes were placed in a local church near her home in Oxfordshire. It was a quiet, understated ending, reflecting the life she had lived in her later years, private, detached, and entirely her own. Years later, after the death of her third husband, William Goodsir, her remains were moved and placed with his, uniting them in burial in Scotland. It was a final gesture that, once again, emphasized the choices she had made. Not defined by family lineage, not tied to inherited identity, but connected to the life she had chosen to build. There was no grand public mourning, no national attention marking her passing. For many, she had already become a distant figure, someone whose story no longer aligned with the central narrative of the Vanderbilt dynasty. And yet, her life left behind a different kind of legacy, not one measured in wealth or property, but in the act of departure itself. She had been given everything that defined success in her world, and she had chosen to walk away from it, not temporarily, not as a statement, but permanently. And in doing so, she created a story that stood apart from the family she came from, one that could not be easily explained, categorized, or fully understood. Because in the end, Cornelia Vanderbilt did something far more difficult than inheriting a legacy. She rejected it and lived with that decision for the rest of her life. After Cornelia's death, the world she left behind continued without interruption, almost as if her absence had long since been absorbed into its structure. Biltmore Estate remained standing, not as a relic of a forgotten past, but as a living institution preserved, maintained, and gradually transformed into one of the most visited historic homes in the United States. Under the management of her sons, George and William, the estate evolved into a sustainable enterprise, balancing history with business, tradition with adaptation. What had once been a private symbol of immense wealth became a public experience, drawing millions of visitors who walked through its halls, admired its architecture, and learned about the Vanderbilt legacy. And yet, within that narrative, Cornelia's role remained complicated. She was part of the story, but not in the way most expected. She was not the figure who preserved Biltmore, nor the one who carried its legacy forward. Instead, she was the one who stepped away from it entirely. The contrast between her path and that of her sons could not have been clearer. Where they chose continuity, she chose separation. Where they maintained the legacy, she redefined her place outside of it. And over time, that contrast became part of the estate's history itself. Visitors might hear her name, learn fragments of her story, perhaps even see remnants of her life preserved in small details, like the famous piece of wedding cake from her 1924 marriage, discovered decades later and still intact, a strange and almost symbolic artifact of a life that had once seemed so perfectly aligned with expectation. But beyond those fragments, her presence faded into something less tangible. She became less a central figure and more a question. Why did she leave? What was she searching for? And did she ever find it? There are no definitive answers, no single explanation that fully accounts for the choices she made. Some see her as eccentric, others as independent, others still as someone who simply refused to accept a life that didn't feel like her own. And perhaps all of those interpretations are true, in part, because Cornelia Vanderbilt's life does not fit neatly into a single narrative. It resists simplification, it challenges expectation, and in doing so, it leaves behind something more enduring than wealth or property, a story that continues to provoke curiosity, not because of what she inherited, but because of what she chose to abandon. In the end, Cornelia Vanderbilt's life does not resolve in the way most stories do. There is no clear moral, no simple lesson, no definitive answer to the question that follows her from beginning to end. Why did she leave? She was born into a world that offered everything wealth beyond measure, security, status, and a future that had already been secured for her. For most, that would have been enough, more than enough. But for Cornelia, it wasn't. And that is where her story becomes something deeper than a biography. Because what she walked away from was not just money or property, it was certainty, the kind of life where every step is planned, every role is defined, and every outcome is predictable. She chose instead a life filled with uncertainty, reinvention, and at times, isolation. A life where identity was not given, but constantly questioned and rebuilt. And she lived with that choice fully. She never returned to reclaim what she had left behind. She never attempted to step back into the role that had once been hers. She allowed that version of her life to end completely, even as it continued on without her through her sons and the estate that still stands today. And perhaps that is the most striking part of her story, not the decision to leave, but the decision to stay away. Because leaving can be impulsive, emotional, temporary, but staying gone requires something else entirely. It requires commitment, acceptance, and the willingness to live with everything that choice brings. Cornelia Vanderbilt did exactly that. She lived a life that few could understand, and even fewer would choose. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that cannot be measured in wealth or history alone. It exists instead in the space between expectation and choice, between what is given and what is taken. A reminder that even in a life where everything is predetermined, there is still one thing that cannot be inherited, controlled, or designed: the decision to walk away.